As I said, in relation to this, I will be going to Parliament and will be making a statement in Parliament. On the wider issue, I did address the wider issue of this. This was a limited and targeted strike that took place last night, or series of strikes that took place last night by the three partners, but nobody should be in any doubt of our resolve on this issue, which is to ensure that we see a return to that international norm on the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. Sorry, yes, the gentleman.
Thank you. Joe Watts, The Independent. The Syrian civil war has seen a huge displacement of people from the Middle East towards the West. I'm just wondering if you think that your action today and the threat of further action from the West will exacerbate that and cause more people, more refugees to come to the West. And if you can tell us what extra planning, extra actions you're going to be taking to address that point, ease the pressure on nations and help the refugees themselves.
Well, you're right to say that, of course, as a result of what has been taking place in Syria over the last few years, 7 years or so, we have seen a large number of people displaced within Syria and obviously a large number of refugees from Syria being displaced both to countries in the region and further afield. And, of course, we have been receiving a number of Syrian refugees here in the UK ourselves. But our focus has always been on support for refugees in the region, with considerable support to countries that have been providing refuge for them. Obviously, Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey are the three countries that have particularly been providing refuge for them. The purpose of this action is to prevent further humanitarian suffering. I think nobody can have been anything but appalled at the scenes that we saw and we've read about from the attack that took place in Douma. It is right, I believe, that the international community has acted to give that very clear message about this use of chemical weapons.
Hi, Jessica Elgott from The Guardian. Prime Minister, are you concerned that you perhaps do not have the support of the British people for this action? Polling has shown that it's around a fifth of people who support further action in Syria. And what's your message to people who are uneasy about the action you've taken?
Well, as I said, I have taken this decision because I believe it is the right thing to do. I think my message to people about this is that this is about the use of chemical weapons. We have, for nearly 100 years now, had a generally accepted position in the international community that, because chemical weapons are illegal, their use is illegal, they're banned, and that has generally been accepted. We have seen that international norm being eroded. It's been eroded in a number of ways. As I say, we've seen a nerve agent used on the streets of a city here in the United Kingdom. But we have seen the Syrian regime continuing to use chemical weapons, despite the fact that after August 2013, they said they were dismantling their chemical weapons, and Russia guaranteed that that was taking place. Though that commitment has not been met. And so I think it is important that for the alleviation of humanitarian suffering in Syria, but also if we stand back and look at this more widely, I think it is in all our interests that we restore that international norm on the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons. Yes.
Glen Owen, Mail on Sunday. How much did you agonise about this decision? Did it keep you awake at night?
As I said in my statement, and I've repeated since, that there is no graver decision that a Prime Minister can take than to send service personnel into combat. And it is a decision that I have not taken lightly. As you know, there have been a number of discussions here with the National Security Council and at Cabinet, together with discussions with our American and French allies on this. But at the end of the day, I felt it was the right thing to do, precisely because we have seen this growing use of chemical weapons. And I think that we must say this must stop. And it is in all our interests for us to ensure that the use of chemical weapons stops. And it's in the interests of all our futures to ensure that the use of chemical weapons stops. Yeah, here on the front row. Sorry, Jay, making you...
Hello, Toby Helm from The Observer. Obviously, there's been no parliamentary approval for this action for reasons of timing, apart from anything else. But when Parliament resumes next week, do you intend to try to get Parliament as a whole to back your strategy, which clearly you are opening the door to possible further action from what you say? Do you intend to push for a vote to get Parliament behind you?
Well, as I say, and as you've picked up, in fact, in your question, I think it was right to take, the decision was taken for operational reasons after we'd had the opportunity to provide the fullest possible assessment and proper planning, and I believe it was the right thing to do. But we will, of course, be giving an opportunity. As I say, I'll be the first opportunity when Parliament resits will be on Monday for me to go into Parliament to make a statement and to hear the views of parliamentarians on this issue. And I will be very clear with Parliament, as I have been clear this morning and have been clear with others, that this is not about action to intervene in the civil war. It is not about anything to do with regime change. It is about the use of chemical weapons. It's a limited and targeted set of strikes that have taken place in order to degrade and deter the capability to use chemical weapons. Sorry, on the second row here.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Rahim Al-Farsi from Sky News Arabia. During your many statements, you have repeatedly talked about the victims of the Duma incident. Have you considered, or are you considering, to have some of these victims have the care and the medical care as the same was given to the cripples here in this country or in the West? And secondly, if it emerges that the Syrian regime has got other chemical sites that have not been attacked, would you go after them, and would you enlarge your tripartite coalition?
Well, first of all, on the first point, obviously one of the issues that we have as a United Kingdom, together with other international parties, had concern for is the ability to access and provide the support necessary to victims, those who have been suffering from the humanitarian catastrophe that has been the use of chemical weapons, but indeed more generally in Syria. And as you will also know, we've made a number of attempts through the United Nations and others in other ways to try to ensure proper humanitarian access to people, to ensure that they can be provided with the proper medical care. And we will continue to push for that humanitarian access so that those who are innocent victims can be provided with the support that they need. As I've said in response to other questions, I believe it's important. This was a collective action taken by the UK together with France and the United States.
British Prime Minister Theresa May calling the military strikes a success, explaining her government's position. Remember, this has turned into a big political debate in Britain as well. Our correspondents Mandy Clark from London and Daniele Pagani from Amman in Jordan continue to be with us. Mandy, first to you. We've seen the questions that the press is asking the Prime Minister of Britain. What is the mood on the ground? Do the British people understand and support the logic behind these military strikes in a land as far off as Syria?
And that's a question she can't really answer. It shows that, one of the journalists pointed to polls that only a fifth of Britons would support more military action. Britain, the public, has a malaise about getting involved in far-off wars. The memories of Iraq and Afghanistan are not that far away, with no clear victory, and the country seemingly to be worse off before the troops came in. So there is a definite hesitation among the British public at large to get into a complex war in Syria. These limited airstrikes is how Theresa May had called the action, specifically targeting infrastructure to prevent the Syrian regime from doing even more chemical attacks. But certainly there's a worry in the British public that Britain might be just there'll be mission creep and they'll slide into another war. So there is hesitation, but certainly the bigger issue that Theresa May is facing is she independently did this action. She did not bring it to Parliament for a debate. She said because there's not enough time, but that's a worry for the British public as well, because she's avoiding those democratic processes to get the approval from Parliament to have gone ahead with these strikes. She didn't also make it clear in the future if she would go to Parliament. She claimed that Parliament's on recess at the moment. She had to do it quickly. But in the future, if there's a requirement, she didn't say whether she would go to Parliament. So there is a worry that this action is happening independent of political will.
The other point that is being made, Mandy, by experts and observers is that there was a fair bit of grandstanding by both Donald Trump and of course, Theresa May and Emmanuel Macron, who made strong statements and warned of strikes, of punishment for the Syrian regime for the chemical attack. And so as days passed, they had to be seen to be doing something, which is why this has happened, because there is no clear policy. Donald Trump wanted to pull out of the war only last week. Now he's talking about newer, smarter missiles, which he believes he's rained on the Syrian regime. I want to focus on Theresa May's statement. She says, and I'm quoting, "This wasn't about regime change or interfering in a civil war. It was a limited, targeted, effective strike." But within minutes, she goes on to say, "This military action does not stand alone. We remain committed to resolving the Syrian conflict." What are they trying to do then?
She also spoke a lot about a political solution, that both sides have to come to the table. So, she's referring also to getting both sides and possibly being a broker for Syria to solve the conflict. But I think there is another message that she is trying to get through, and that is to Russia. So she did say the reason why they took this action is to stop normalizing of chemical weapons attack. But then she said, and there was a chemical weapon attack in Salisbury. Of course, that was the poisoning of the former Russian spy in the UK, and she said we don't want it normalized anywhere. And so that was a clear signal to Russia that they will not accept any more use of nerve agents, whether it's on the streets of Britain or in Syria. And there's a big question about Russia's role in the British mind, in the British public, whether they had supported this chemical attack that the Syrian regime conducted on some people.
Right. Daniele, the British Prime Minister describes today's military strikes as successful. Would you agree with her assessment?
Well, in theory, it is a success. Why so? Because at the end of the day, you targeted several objectives and you hit those objectives and you destroyed those objectives. These are the objectives you claim were decided beforehand. So, in theory, this is a success. I can't deny it's a success. But if we analyze the very true meaning of the word success, which means something effectively hitting some scenario, I would say this is a very symbolic attack. We still need to assess the damage, but things on the ground stand as they were. Nothing has changed. Russian interests have not been threatened in Syria. Iranian interests have not been threatened in Syria. The Syrian government might have been hit, yes, but not where it hurts. Its military strength is exactly where it was before this attack. So, yes, on paper you can define it, semantically speaking, you can define it as success. If success means that you effectively hit something where it hurts, militarily speaking, obviously, well, I wouldn't go so far as defining this as success. It's more of a, I would say, mediatic-built attack.
Also, the messaging is interesting. We heard from Jim Mattis saying that this was a one-time action. We are not following up. We are not planning a follow-up just yet. We heard from Theresa May saying this was a limited, targeted, effective strike, and that's where it ends. Is this a message to the players in the region that we had to do something, so we've done this, and it's over now, and let's come to the talking table?
It is both a message and a wish, I would say, because normally you don't always control the reactions of actors on the ground after you do such a thing. But yes, they made it clear in every possible press conference, the President of France, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, everyone has made it clear this is a one-off military option. It is not made to target Russians. It is not made to target anyone or anything but premises belonging to the Syrian government connected to the production, the storage and the research of chemical weapons. So this is obviously a narrative which is trying to contain possible reactions and making it very clear that this tripartite coalition does not intend to go anywhere else but this chemical weapons affair. It remains to be seen in the coming hours and maybe days what kind of reaction comes into their way, because wishing that nothing happens and effectively avoiding then something happens are two different things.
Right. Mandy, my final question, what is London's assessment of how this is going to pan out in the days ahead? Because the Russians have called for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, which is an indication perhaps that they're not looking at an immediate military retaliation.
Yeah, it's unclear, but certainly there's a lot of provocation from certainly the Russian embassy. There has been bizarre statement saying that the United Kingdom was behind the chemical attack in Syria. So there's certainly a lot of politicking that's going on between Russia and the UK. The relations could only be described as frigid. They're barely any communication. So there's not a lot of clarity how Russia will react, because they have been acting quite surprising lately. But Theresa May pointed out that they have blocked a lot of the UN calls for investigation. The UK will be very interested in what they plan to do at this meeting, but the Russians are being quite hard to predict at the minute, and that has kept London certainly on its toes.
Also hard to predict, Daniele, would be Tehran. The reactions have been on expected lines, but are they going to go beyond the tough words?
I don't think they are going to take any military action in Syria. Why so? They don't have the military capability for doing so. Remember that Iran only holds controls in several militias with good weaponry when it comes to ground offensive, but nothing near to any possible arsenal which could allow you to attack the United States presence in West Asia. They might use other scenarios, like, for instance, Yemen, if at all they have a true and still they have any influence on the Yemeni Houthi rebels, to attack allies of the United States of America in the region, like Saudi Arabia. That might be an option that Tehran has. But as of now, in Syria, I very much doubt that Tehran is capable of retaliating alone. And also, would you actually bear the responsibility of attacking the United States of America and therefore perhaps triggering, in the best case scenario, a war between the US and Iran, and in the worst case scenario, the Third World War? I don't think Tehran has any interest in doing that.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has also spoken in favor of the US-led strikes on Syria.
化学兵器の拡散と使用は絶対に許さないとのアメリカ、イギリス、フランスの決意を日本政府としては支持いたします。その上で今回の行動はこれ以上の事態の悪化を防ぐための措置と理解しています。
France too hit out at the Syrian regime, blaming Bashar al-Assad for breaking international law. The French foreign minister said, and I quote, "These cruise missiles were fired at the chosen targets in close coordination with our British and American partners. We do not seek confrontation and we refuse any possibility of military escalation. We had ensured that the Russians were warned beforehand."
L'action est proportionnée et ciblée. Elle ne cherche pas à atteindre les alliés d'Assad, ni la population civile, mais à dissuader le régime syrien de poursuivre ses actions criminelles. Le régime de Damas doit cesser d'employer de telles armes.
French President Emmanuel Macron in a statement said that France's red line has been crossed after a suspected chemical attack in Douma. He said the airstrikes were limited to Syria's abilities to produce chemical weapons. He also tweeted a video showing what the president's office said were Rafale fighter jets taking off for launching attacks on Syria. It was not immediately clear whether the jets were taking off from an aircraft carrier or a military base. The French presidency did not specify from where these planes took off. UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres called for restraint to avoid any acts that could escalate the situation in Syria. He delayed a planned trip to Saudi Arabia to deal with the aftermath of the US military action in Syria. In a statement, the UN chief said, and I quote, "I urge all member states to show restraint in these dangerous circumstances and to avoid any acts that could escalate the situation and worsen the suffering of the Syrian people." Exasperated by the US strikes, Russia has accused Washington of violating international conventions and has called for an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council after the airstrikes in Syria. A Russian defense official has claimed airstrikes in Syria did not hit areas near Russian bases. Moscow has also responded to the joint airstrikes by the US, the UK and France with a threat of retaliation. Russia's envoy to the US said, and I quote, "The worst apprehensions have come true. We warn that such actions will not be left without consequences." The US, the possessor of the biggest arsenal of chemical weapons, has no moral right to blame other countries. Russian officials have claimed a significant number of US missiles were intercepted by Syrian air defenses. Meanwhile, Russia is likely to call for a meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss these airstrikes.
The Assad government today is the single most powerful political entity in Syria. It controls the widest swathe of the country, from the Jordanian border in the south to the city of Aleppo in the northwest. The gains, though, have been at enormous cost. More than 5 million Syrians have fled the country. 6 million are internally displaced, living as refugees in their own country. The death toll is estimated at around 400,000, and more have disappeared. The war in Syria has many stakeholders. Russia has been a solid ally of the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. Russian airstrikes since 2015 and supplies of arms and equipment have been critical to turning the tide in favor of President Bashar al-Assad. Iran is another key ally of President Bashar al-Assad. Troops of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard have fought on the ground with Assad's army. Then the United States and Saudi Arabia have funded and armed the so-called moderate rebels, who at the end turned out to be jihadis with too many ties to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And Turkey has also backed the rebels of the so-called Free Syrian Army against the Kurds on their borders. Peace talks to end the Syrian conflict have got nowhere so far. The Syrian government has regained control of some of the biggest cities, but large parts of the country are still held by rebel groups. While cities like Aleppo, Hama and particularly Damascus and the majority of the capital city have been retaken by the government, the province of Idlib, here close to the border with Turkey, and also Eastern Ghouta, which is the suburbia close to Damascus, remain under rebel control, or at least under rebel influence. The worsening relations between the United States and Russia too have deepened the deadlock over Syria, and these has also stymied plans for rebuilding Syria, which could cost as much as $200 billion. And Kurds are still in control of this entire northern part. Turkey has invaded the canton of Afrin, and they say that they are ready to move towards the entire Rojava.